coffee table that sits next to my recliner. My recliner is my refuge. It's my place. Do you have a place of refuge in your sitting areas? Don't touch my recliner. But next to my recliner, on this little coffee table, there sits a book right now, and it's called Reflections of a Mother's Heart. Perhaps you've seen this resource before. How many of you have seen this or have it? Anyone? So it's an incredible gift to me from my mom. It's in the title. The pages that this book contain are questions that prompt the writer to respond, to reflect on life. And so what I have written down her reflections on the previous generation from her life as well as her own. So there's like a family history. There's a record of what her parents were like and what life was like for her growing up as a child in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There are things that she shares what her values are. And for me, it stands as a valuable instrument of perspective. Seeing her reflections gives me perspective on the things that I'm facing and the things that I'm doing. It also convicts me because I don't have a reflections of a dad's heart quite yet for my kids. But it's a precious gift. And I know that it was a meaningful exercise for her to just take the time to look back and reflect. There's something perspective shaping when we do that. And I find in my life, I easily lose perspective about the simple things that I know to be true. Like I know it's true that God is God and I am not. Yet, it is so easy for me to slip into this idea that if it's going to be, it's up to me. He's God, I'm not, but I can easily slip into, if it's going to be, it's up to me. And so I better worry about things that are out of my control. That seems like a worthwhile use of my energy. Doesn't this seem worthwhile for you? It is not worthwhile, but yet, if you're anything like me, we easily lose perspective. That's exactly what has happened to this group of believers that came out of a Judaism faith and heritage, and they've come to know and follow Jesus Christ, but there has been a loss of perspective for them where they've shifted their eyes away from God. They're chasing empty, lifeless pursuits that is leaving them, leaving them in a state that I find my mom often in. When I look at the reflections that she puts down, and I'm not holding her up as someone who's perfect, but there is for my mother a restful trust and an anchored hope in her life. She's quick, at least to extend to someone else, an abiding and deep trust in the Lord. She's a woman of perspective. Restful trust and anchored hope. Doesn't that sound like the book of Hebrews to us? If you can remember over these last several weeks. And I think that those are the very two things that are lost when we lose perspective. We do not have a restful trust, or we do not have an anchored hope. Much like these individuals that are being written to in this letter, there is a perspective that God holds for His people, including us, and we need it, y'all. We need the truth that's found in Hebrews chapter 8, and I want to invite you to turn with me there. Hebrews chapter 8, we're going to be in verses 1 through 5 this morning. Hebrews 8, 1 to 5. Over the course of these 5 verses, we're going to be able to wrestle with some questions that hopefully by the end of our time, these questions will help us have a better view and sight, better perspective. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Now that we've come into Hebrews 8, we enter a new section of this sermon. Now remember, this entire letter is laying out like a sermon, a long, drawn-out sermon, like a Hinkle sermon. This new section goes from chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 18. And one of the unique aspects of this is that we will not find a word of instruction from this passage. There's a lot of exposition, there's a lot of explanation that the sermon writer is providing for the people of God. Now, it will be my challenge to draw out the so what for us as we go through. But from chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 10, verse 18, there's not going to be a specific thing found in the letter that says, okay, so this is then how we should live. Once we get to 10:19, you will buckle up, buttercup, because it's going to be a series of instructions of now how then should we live. Hebrews 8, verses 1 through 5. I want to read through the passage and then we will walk through it and then wrestle with some questions. Passage reads, "Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, 'See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain.'" May God bless his word and help our understanding through it. I want to talk through this passage in two sections. The first section is just going to be the first verse. There's so much found in the first verse that we will just sit there for a little bit, and then we will look at the rest of the passage together. I love how the New Testament helps us. If you've been confused at all through reading through the book of Hebrews, the opening words of this chapter should really help you. Now the point in what we are saying is this. I need phrases like that in the scriptures. Because sometimes the Bible can be hard to understand. But here the author is laying it out. Y'all, here it is. Here is the point I am making and which I am writing to you. We have such a high priest. I talked to you last week about how there was this rising crescendo through the first part of this sermon about the uniquely great Jesus that we have. He's the better prophet, he's the better king, he's the better priest. And that theme has been building and building and building until it came to the crescendo of which Mike read the scripture from last week earlier in our service, where this priest is described as unstained and holy, innocent, exalted on high. And so the writer of Hebrews says, here's the point. We have such a priest. It says that he is one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Now, this verse is important, and this phrase about the nature of Jesus is critically important for us to understand. It says, this is one who is seated. He is seated. Now, this is much more significant than he has a really awesome chair somewhere. Or that it's just giving a location. Hey, he's sitting down. What this means, first of all, is that you sit down when your work is complete. Like my recliner. At the end of a long day, you come in, we do the hustle and bustle around dinner, gloat over whose kid is it to do the dishes that night and not me? But then the moment arrives when for a moment I can be what? Seated. So there's an element of finished and completedness that's found in this word. There's something that has been complete by our high priest. He is one who is seated, and we're given additional material here. He's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Well, this detail is critically important for us. It gives the type of setting in which he's seated. And the setting is the throne of heaven. This is the throne room. Christ is seated in the position of authority and majesty that belongs only to him. He's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. If he's seated, this means that his work as a high priest is complete. Listen to what's coming for us in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. There's some explanation that helps us where we are in this passage. It says, "And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God." For the priests, the Levitical priests, there were no chairs to be found in the tent or in the temple. They stood up to do the ritual sacrifices. They would walk in, they would make sacrifices for themselves and make sacrifices for the other people. There was no sitting down because there was no end to continually making sacrifices over and over and over and over and over and over for the people. But Jesus did something uniquely greater, didn't he? He made a sacrifice once and for all. And it wasn't through an animal, it was through himself. He offered himself up for us. And it was sufficient. His payment was sufficient for us. So, as the high priest, he sat down. He's seated. We have the greater priest and king. If this would be an idea that would sum up verse 1, we have the greater priest and king. Christ is uniquely better, supremely greater because of his unique role. And we've talked about it, and we've talked about it, and we've talked about it. And one of the reasons why I wanted us as a body to go through the book of Hebrews is to be reminded at just how great and supremely great Jesus Christ truly is. And so we're hearing it, and we're hearing it again and again. He is the greater priest and king, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies like found in Zechariah chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, which talk about a uniquely priest and king. Interestingly, the name ascribed in that passage is Joshua, which is also Yeshua, which is also, oh man, y'all, yes! It's Jesus. Psalm 110 is a messianic psalm talking about the king who is going to come and to reign, but he is described as a great priest. Jesus is this greater priest and king, and we have such a greater priest and king. This is why the writer of Hebrews says this is the point. We have him, y'all. Now, if we would have taken a pre-sermon quiz, I think we would have passed if I would have said, do you believe you have the greater priest and king? You probably would have gotten that correct. So our problem and our challenge is not necessarily a knowledge issue. But here's the first question I'd like for us to wrestle with. Do you see anything in your life beyond his control? Do you see anything in your life that's beyond him? The next question that this prompts, and this I hope will actually be a reflection question for you, and you've got your program and you can take notes and you can write this down, but here's the question that follows that. Do the words restful trust most describe you today? Last week I talked about the debt that we have where we're so easily distracted, exhausted, burdened, and tempted. I heard from several of you that this actually resonated with you as the perfect description of life. We have a knowledge base that tells the Christian we have a uniquely greater priest and king who's Jesus. And if we were to answer the question, do we believe that there's anything that's beyond his control? There most likely would be from our mouths a resounding no. Of course not. If I'm asked to objectively look at my life and my circumstances, I would never say that there's something in my life that's beyond his control. But when probed a little deeper, did restful trust most describe me today? I think it can reveal something a little bit deeper. I have a journal here, and this journal began, I think, in, let's see if it says here, 2016. So just a few years ago. And what's interesting about this journal is I use it for a number of different things: reflection of thoughts, prayers, meeting notes. I can look back and instantly be transported to my life and time at that stage. It's one of the benefits of just being able to put something down on paper. It takes you right back. And in this particular instance, I was struggling. I think I was actually in the beginnings of discerning that my call was changing from God. It took from 2016 at least to 2020 for me to get it. You're quicker than I am, it's okay. But in a time of just reflecting in Scripture, this is what I was prompted to put down. Because I was very anxious. And restful trust certainly did not describe my life and the state of my mind. As a result of reflecting on a text, I just wrote down, I am with you. I am leading you. I am sustaining you. I am covering you. I got you. I will establish my work. I will supply in ways not yet seen. I will do this because I brought you thus far. Trust me over opinion or your own understanding. Seek my wisdom and I will provide. You are loved, forgiven, redeemed. I can satisfy your soul. I'm satisfied in my Son, who's your advocate. I know your needs and will supply. Hunger to know me. Seek me continually. I will provide, David. You are my son too, and I will accomplish my will in you. It was just a moment of just a written reflection of what did I sense that the Father was prompting me through His Spirit. Do you have restful hope, friends? Do you see the truth that Jesus truly is uniquely greater over every circumstance? He's not fretting. He's not worrying. He is seated. He holds all authority. He holds all power. Nothing that has been passed through His hand to allow to us has caught Him by surprise. He does not slumber. He does not sleep. He is seated. We have such a great priest and king. And He offers restful trust for those who will seek Him, those who will look to Him. Verse 1 describes his person as our unique priest king. Verses 2 through 5 describe his ministry. While he is seated, there's still work that Jesus is accomplishing on our behalf. And let's see how uniquely greater that is. Starting in verse 2, I'll read through verse 5. He's a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. But when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So it's through our greater priest that we have access to restful trust. And because we have him, we get to see his uniquely greater ministry for us. And it's emphasized by way of comparison. So if you look at the passage with me, in verse 2, it says, he's a minister in the holy places in the true tent. You should underline, circle the idea of true tent, because this is important imagery that will get explained in the passage. But this idea that I want you to see at this point is that it's true. There's a comparison being made. So if Jesus is true, there's something else out there that is false or incomplete. That's exactly right. He's the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. We've seen this. We've seen that it is by the appointment of God the Father that the Son has been named the unique priest king. It was not set up by man. So now we have a description of what's being compared, and it says, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. That's the warp and woof of the role of a priest. That's what distinguished the role of the priest from any other role for the people of God. They offered gifts and sacrifices to the Lord on behalf of the people. So if someone is going to function as a priest, there has to be this kind of offering or this kind of ministry that takes place. It says it's necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. What does Jesus offer us as our uniquely greater priest and king? Well, earlier in the text that Mike read in our worship service, he said that Jesus as our priest was able to save to the uttermost. And he makes intercession for us. These are two aspects of the priestly work that Christ accomplishes. Number one, he made a perfect sacrifice for the sin of the world. That whoever would believe in Jesus Christ as their Savior would be forgiven by his sacrifice. His sacrifice would be sufficient and made effective to you if you would believe and trust that Jesus is God's Son who died on the cross for your sin and rose from the dead. That is his completed work, but he also makes intercession for us. He's at work. We're told by the Apostle Paul in the opening chapters of the book of Ephesians in chapter 1 that in him we have every spiritual gift in the heavenly places. We have access to these great gifts from God because Christ reigns from the heavens and he ministers on our behalf and he intercedes for us. He has a uniquely greater ministry. Verse 4 is an interesting verse. It's kind of like a parenthesis within the passage. He's going to set up, the author's going to set up kind of an argument. He's going to say, now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. So it says, now if he were on earth, he's not. He's where? He's in heaven. He would not be a priest at all. But he is. He's in heaven. Since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. This is trying to emphasize the fact that Jesus is the greater comparison of these priests because he's not constrained to mortality. He's not constrained to his own sins that he had to make atonement for. He's greater. The Levitical priests were actually foreshadowing Christ, this is verse 5, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Jesus set up and established something that was true. The Levitical priest and the Levitical system was a copy and a foreshadow of what would be revealed in him. For when Moses was given instructions to set up the tent, he was instructed by God saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain." So we can see the imagery that's being woven through the text. He is the true tabernacle. He's the true tent, appointed and positioned by God the Father. And in order to represent what he might be like, there was a shadow of a system put into place. And it was in a specific pattern given by God that would eventually point the people to Jesus. This means that the Jewish people were supposed to be able to look back into the Old Testament scriptures and see Christ revealed plainly. Their work was insufficient because of their own inadequacy and insufficiency as priests. Christ's work of sacrifice was completed once and for all. And from his throne where he reigns, he intercedes on behalf of his people. So we have such a great high priest and king who has the greater ministry. So we have him, and he has the greater work. The finished work of salvation and the ongoing work of intercession on behalf of his people. I'm reading through the Bible with men in my life group, and we've been making our way through the book of Job. And to be honest with you, there's been some days 4 or 5 chapters of Job in one day. Whew. But what I see emphasized through this is something that's coming. It's coming in chapter 42, where there's this great line where Job acknowledges to the Lord, "I know you can do all things, and no purpose of yours will be thwarted." He knows the ministry, the work of God, and that nothing can prevail against his work. And this is coming from Job, who is the definition of someone who is burdened and tempted and exhausted and distracted. Yet within him there was this acknowledgement that God is greater than all, and no purpose of his will ever be thwarted. We have such a great high priest and king who has a greater ministry. So let me ask you this question, and we can wrestle with this. Do you see him failing in his ministry to you? Do you see him dropping the ball when it comes to you and your circumstances? Does it seem like Christ is busy with somebody else? We wrestle with this, I believe, because we don't see the outcome that we want in our circumstances. There's kind of the way things are. We don't like the way things are. And we aren't seeing clearly the outcome which we would want. Again, today's reading through the Bible with the men in my life group, Psalm 42 was part of that. And David writes, "Why so downcast, O my soul?" He has this honest expression of, my life is not what I want it to be. And I'm depressed about it. I'm at a loss to understand what is being allowed to happen. Why am I suffering? Why am I being persecuted? Why am I being chased? Why is this being allowed? Do you see him failing in his ministry to you? Now again, my friends, if we would have come in today and I would have said this question, you would say, oh, Pastor Hinkle, no way. And you would look so good and you would have the right thing to say. But here's another question for us to wrestle with. Do the words anchored in hope most describe you today? Are you planted in the promise of God? Are you rooted in His work on your behalf? I don't believe Jesus Christ will fail at anything. I believe Jesus Christ cannot fail at anything. But do these words of anchored in hope describe you? My mom, she wrestled with having adult kids. Any of you have adult kids? I'm new to your club. I like the club, but it's a different kind of parenting. I have moved from coach, where I get to call the play, see if they'll run the play. Sometimes they call an audible, but then you can correct the player. So I've gone from calling the play, sending them in, they run the play, to now consultant, where my advice is wanted when asked. Do any of you know this land called parenting adults? My mother knew that. So she prayed to the Lord about it. This is June 19th, 1996. Lord, I pray that David and I'm named after my dad. I pray that David and I will learn the art of parenting adult children. Yes, we still are parents, underlined. Yes, we still have an influence on our children, but it must be from a distance. We must not be prone to offer unsolicited advice. We must be still and pray and be ready to help when asked, underlined. Father, I pray for our son David. I pray he will have a continued sense of your presence and guidance in his life. I pray he will be open and eager to learn from the maturity and wisdom of a man named Tom Tucker. He was a discipling influence of mine. And the vigor and enthusiasm of Jeff Hickey, who was pastor in my life at that time. Thank you for the influence of these two men in David's life. She goes on to pray for my trumpet professor and his influence on my life. And I turn the page, and she says, Father, please bless the lovely young woman who will become David's wife. May she have a heart to serve you. May she love children. May she recognize, wasn't expecting that. May she recognize the role of the helpmeet. Lord, bless her. Bless her family. May she come from a strong Christian home. Prepare our hearts to receive her. Prepare her heart to receive David. Prepare David to recognize and receive her. I offer this up to you because she walked in this kind of new no man's land of how do you parent well with people who are 100% responsible for their own choices. How do you navigate this? And there were things that were frustrating to her. Choices that I would make. I think it was more my silence towards them. I just didn't call a lot. I was living my college life. I loved my college life. In some ways, I was escaping some things that I felt were broken in my life. And so I was just charging ahead, consumed with my interests. In that season of my life, my parents were somewhat taken for granted. I loved them, but I think my mom felt that. And yet, what does she do? at least in this moment, she took her questions, she took what she could not control, and she laid it at the feet of Christ. She is an example of someone anchored in hope. It wasn't perfect, and if she were in here, she would say, I'm really embarrassed. Because she looks at her life and she knows that it was an ebb and flow. But I look at what I have seen and can reflect on. And I see someone who had restful trust and anchored hope. And it leaves me wanting that. I want the words of restful hope or restful trust and anchored hope to describe all of us. That's not to say that we'll be unaffected by life's challenges. It's just that life's challenges should be the very thing that draw us to our Savior. He is seated. His work is finished. His work is complete. He cannot fail. He cannot and He will not. And He says, come. Come to me with your fears. Come to me with your hopes. Come to me with everything. See me for who I am. And this is our call. We must see Him greater. Greater in who He is, greater in the ministry that He serves. We must see Him as greater. Two components that I believe that will help us see Him as greater. One, reflect for perspective. Reflect for perspective. It was helpful for me to go back into, quite honestly, a season of my life that was challenging. It was a mixed bag as there was a slow redirection of my life. There were times where I felt lonely. There were times that I felt uncertain. Even though I could, in the midst of that, I could pause, I could still hear the Father's voice prompting me, reminding me of promises. But now, in reflection, it gives me such great perspective. God had intended to draw us here to be with you guys. To walk out what I hope is a very long season of ministry together. He had never failed me, and He was always greater than my questions. And reflecting gives perspective. And secondly, worship while waiting. This is what I love about Psalm 42, because in the midst of all of the questions that were the troubles of David's life and the inconsistencies of his walk and the threats that came from outside of him, he still drew near to God to worship Him. You will never face a circumstance or a problem that removes Jesus from the rightful place where He's seated. So He remains worthy of our worship. He never moves from His position of glory and honor. And despite your questions, and despite what outcomes you are still waiting to see, He's worthy of our praise. May we not forget, He is our King. He is our eternal priest. He is greater and remains greater. So worship while you wait. I believe through acts of reflection and continued enduring worship, we will see Him. And we will find at the end of our journey the words that Job shared, that no purpose of yours could ever be or has ever been thwarted. And you have done what you said you would do. What I love about the timing that the Lord has in reflection is June 19th, 1996 was around the time that I invited Amy Abels on a date. And from June 1996, we dated, and then on November of 96, I asked her to be my wife. And I look back and I'm moved emotionally when I see the faithfulness of God. I remember that season of life. Angsty, college. I had great hair, y'all. I was a kid with great hair and lots of questions. I didn't know where I was going to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to be. It was not a foregone conclusion that I'd end up in ministry. It was just a swirl of good hair and question marks. Now I have no hair, but I have more answers. I have more answers about the plan of God which has been unfolding. We can be people of restful trust and anchored hope if we see Him as greater.